Okay, so if we're going to complete the square in order, and the real idea to do this is to find the vertex and the line of symmetry. That's why we bothered to learn how to do this, at least before calculus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at that. I'm going to look at that function, and in order to do the completing the square, I got to make sure that the leading coefficient, the coefficient with the x squared is 1. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide both sides of that equation by 2, and that leaves me 1/2 of the f of x, or 1/2 of y. And then the 2x squared here, maybe I better write this out. 2x squared plus 8x plus 7. So I'm going to divide this by 2, divide this by 2, divide this by 2. So that leaves me x squared plus 4x, which is nice. And then we've got that plus 7/2 that's coming along for the ride. Now what we're trying to do when we complete the square is we're trying to get something x plus or minus some number squared plus some number out here. Okay, that's what we're trying to get. And then of course if there's some leading coefficient, that's going to be the a that I moved out of the way. In this case it'll be 2. So in order to get that perfect square binomial, that's why we're completing the square. Remember, we take half of the middle term. So what's half of 4? Well, that's 2, and then I'm going to square it. And I'm going to be a little lazy, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it as 2 squared here. It's actually not lazy. I'm working smart. So I added inside the parentheses because I'm doing everything on the same side of the equal sign. I have to subtract that 2 squared outside the parentheses. That way I'm not changing the value of the equation. I'm just rewriting it. So I got that. Now why did I bother not to write 4 plus 4 inside? Well, what the beautiful thing about thinking about it this way is so now I'm going to try to factor this to x and x. And what are the factors of 4 that will add to give me 4 in the middle? Well, it just so happens that it's 2. Notice that those are exactly the same thing. So instead of having to write them twice, we're just going to write it as x minus 2 quantity squared. And then, of course, I got to deal with the 7/2. So I get 7/2 minus 8/2. Because 4 is the same as 8/2. Now 7/2 minus 8/2, common denominators, that leaves me 1/2. Let me get rid of those. And then I still have that 1/2 times f of x on the other side. So I want to multiply it back through. So if I multiply both sides of this equation by 2, I have to remember to distribute it through. So it's 2 times the quantity x plus 2 squared minus, and then what's 1/2 times 2, or negative 1/2 times 2 is negative 1. And lo and behold, isn't that what they have for the answer? So that's how you do completing the square. Now, why is that important? Well, then I can say, okay, so the vertex is at, remember, the general form for these is a minus h squared plus k, or whatever you want to use for variables here. It could be b and c. I use b and c over here. Well, this is negative, and if that's going to be negative, the only way that can happen is if it's minus on minus 2 squared minus 1. Notice the k doesn't change. So the vertex is going to be -2, -1. And then, of course, you were able to graph that correctly. So, all right. So hopefully that helps you do these completing the squares. Did I not share? I stop recording.